My parents said I was dead to them, then showed up asking for help. I'm 31, my name's Tyler, and I live in a small one-bedroom apartment just outside Columbus, Ohio. The day this all happened started like any other boring Saturday for me. Half-cold coffee on my desk, laundry piled in a basket I kept pretending I was about to fold, and that kind of gray Midwest sky that makes it feel like 5 p.m. all day long. I was sitting in sweatpants at my cheap IKEA table, scrolling through Reddit and pretending I'd start meal prep after this one more video, when my phone lit up face down and buzzed against the fake wood. I almost ignored it, because I ignore most calls, but some stupid instinct made me flip it over, and that's when I saw the first thing that made my stomach drop. A missed call from an unknown Ohio number and a voicemail waiting. I don't get many voicemails, so just seeing that little icon already put me on edge. I put my coffee down, wiped my hands on my hoodie like I was about to touch something important, and hit play on speaker. I recognized the voice before my brain even processed the words. It was my mom. I hadn't heard her voice in 5 years, not since she looked me in the eye in our old living room and said I was dead to them because I refused to sign my name on a loan to cover one of my dad's messes. Hearing her now, shaky and smaller somehow, felt like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed. She said my name once, like she was testing it, and then she said they were in town and needed to talk to me today, please, and that it was important and they didn't know who else to call. Then the message just cut off abruptly, like she ran out of nerve or someone took the phone away. I sat there staring at my phone like it had just insulted me. The apartment suddenly felt too quiet. I could hear the fridge humming, the neighbor above me walking from one end of their place to the other, my own heartbeat in my ears. It was crazy how clear that old scene came back. Me at 26, standing by the front door of my parents' house, my dad red in the face, my mom crying into a dish towel, both of them telling me I was ungrateful, selfish, not really their son anymore if I turned my back on family. That was the last night I slept in that house. I still remember stuffing my clothes into trash bags because no one even offered me a suitcase. So hearing my mom's voice now, like we were just picking up after a small misunderstanding, made something hot and bitter crawl up my throat. For context, my parents didn't just ask me for a favor that night 5 years ago. By the time they were screaming that I was dead to them, I had already found out they'd emptied the college savings account that was supposed to be mine and used it to cover one of my dad's gambling debts. I found out when a bank statement showed up in the mail with my name on it and a zero balance where there was supposed to be something like 25 grand. When I called them on it, they told me it was all for the family, and I'd benefit eventually. Eventually turned out to mean they'd also wanted me to co-sign a consolidation loan in my name to patch over more of his crap. When I said no, that's when they pulled the whole "you're dead to us" thing. So yeah, we weren't just not talking. They nuked the bridge, salted the ground, and then lit it again for fun. In the years since, I built a life that was small but mine. I work IT help desk for a logistics company downtown. It's not glamorous, but I like having a badge, a chair, and a paycheck that hits on the same 2 days every month. I play pickup basketball with coworkers on Tuesday nights. I have a girlfriend, Emma, who works weekends at a coffee shop and stays over a few nights a week. And I have my routines. Kroger on Sunday evenings, trash out on Wednesday, call with my friend Nate on Fridays while we both complain about our bosses. My parents existed like background static, there, but very far away. No birthday calls, no Christmas texts, nothing. I saw my brother's life through Instagram, and I saw my parents' faces once in a blurry photo from some cousin's wedding that I wasn't invited to. That was it. So them suddenly being in my city, asking for help, made the room tilt. I replayed the voicemail 3 times. Each time, I picked up small details that annoyed me more. My mom's voice trying to sound gentle at the start, like we were just a little distant. The way she slipped, "We're in Columbus," into the middle of a sentence like that was a normal thing. The tiny pause before she said, "We didn't know who else to call," like she knew exactly how that would land and hoped guilt would do the rest. My hands were actually shaking a little, which pissed me off, because I don't want them to have that kind of power over me anymore. I got up, walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, stared at the same leftovers I'd stared at earlier, and then closed it again without taking anything. I just needed to move. I wish I could say my first instinct was to ignore them, block the number, and go on with my day, but that'd be a lie. I stood there trying to picture my mom in some motel off the interstate, my dad pacing, both of them older and more worn out, and I felt that old tug of responsibility that I hate. I thought about my grandma, who used to call me the responsible one, and how she'd probably guilt-trip me from beyond the grave if she knew I left them stranded. Then I thought about the bank statements with my name on them, the way my dad smirked when he told me that money was never really yours, and my stomach clenched again. It was like my brain was flipping through a messy file cabinet of every good and bad memory at once. After pacing a groove into the cheap laminate between my kitchen and living room, I finally grabbed my phone and typed out the most neutral thing I could think of. What's going on? No, hey. No, it's Tyler. No, hope everything's okay. Just that. I stared at it longer than I cared to admit before hitting send. The message felt too bright on the screen, like it was shouting at me. A minute later, the 3 dots popped up. They disappeared, then appeared again. My chest felt tight in that annoying way anxiety has where you suddenly become very aware of your own breathing. The reply was from my mom, obviously. She said they really needed to talk, and that it was complicated and not something they could explain over text. She said they were about 15 minutes away, and could they please stop by my place, just for a bit, and that they weren't here to cause trouble. I actually laughed at that. Not cause trouble. Sure. I thought about suggesting a public place, a coffee shop, somewhere I could leave without them making a scene, but the idea of dragging my family drama into some cafe where Emma might be working made my skin crawl. So I told myself that I was an adult with a lock on his door and neighbors on either side, and I texted back my address before I could overthink it. Once I hit send, the reality of what I'd just done crashed over me. I looked around my apartment like it suddenly belonged to someone else, and they were on their way to judge it. There were 2 mismatched mugs on the coffee table, an empty chip bag folded over on the couch arm, my work backpack half unzipped with a tangle of charging cables spilling out. I rushed to clean up, not because I cared what they thought of my place, but because I needed something mindless to do with my hands. I tossed the chip bag, stacked the mugs in the sink, wiped a ring off the table with the sleeve of my hoodie. I kicked my basketball shoes into the closet and yanked the door closed before my brain could wander into old memories of my dad yelling from the stands at my high school games. My apartment smells mostly like detergent and whatever I last cooked, but that afternoon it felt weirdly airless. I cracked the small balcony door to let in some of the cold air. It had that wet, late fall smell, like distant rain and exhaust from the highway. I checked myself in the bathroom mirror and hated that I cared what I looked like. I combed my hair back anyway, splashed water on my face, and then just stood there, gripping the edge of the sink, watching a drop of water slide down the side of the mirror. Part of me wanted them to show up looking terrible, like life had dragged them just enough that they'd finally understand what they did. Another part expected them to walk in like nothing happened, like I'd been the one in the wrong this whole time. The buzzer rang earlier than I expected, this harsh metallic sound that made me jump. I wiped my hands on my jeans, walked to the intercom, and pressed the button to let them in without saying anything. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I cracked the apartment door and listened to the echo of footsteps coming up the stairwell. When I finally looked through the peephole, I saw 2 people who were familiar and not at the same time. My dad looked smaller somehow, like someone had deflated his shoulders, and his hair, which used to be all dark with just a few gray strands, was mostly gray now. My mom was holding this big, worn-out tote bag on one arm and a thick manila envelope clutched against her chest with the other. They both looked exhausted in a way that went beyond just being tired. When I opened the door, the smell hit me first. Cigarette smoke clinging to their coats, cheap cologne, and underneath it all that faint scent that reminded me of their old house, like laundry detergent and dust. For a second, nobody said anything. My mom's eyes glossed over a little like she might cry, and my dad glanced past me into the apartment like he was sizing it up. I stepped aside without a word and let them walk in. My mom sat on the edge of the couch like she was afraid of leaving a mark. The tote bag collapsed at her feet, and she kept her hand resting on that envelope like it was some kind of life raft. My dad remained standing for a moment, hands in his pockets, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, before he finally dropped down into the old armchair in the corner with a grunt. The air felt thick. I could hear the clock on my microwave ticking from the kitchen. I took the chair opposite them, the one I usually sit in to play video games, and for a minute the 3 of us just existed in this weird bubble of silence. I was very aware of small things, the way my mom's knee bounced under her jeans, the fact that my dad kept sniffing like he had a cold, the soft hum of the heating unit kicking on behind me. My eyes kept going back to that manila envelope. It was overstuffed and wrinkled at the corners, with someone's handwriting in blue ink across the front that I couldn't quite make out from where I was sitting. It felt like the whole reason they were there was stuffed inside that thing. My mom adjusted it again, like it was heavy, and my dad finally cleared his throat, the sound rough and familiar in a way that made my teeth clench. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a casual, we were in the neighborhood visit. My dad was the first one to actually speak, which weirdly made sense. He's always been the one to set the tone, even when the tone was terrible. He started with my name, said it like he'd been practicing it in the car, then launched into this awkward, rambling explanation about a situation and some stuff that got complicated and how they might have made some mistakes, but that wasn't why they were here. He danced around it so much that I could feel my patience evaporating. I watched his mouth move and kept thinking about how, the last time we were in the same room, that same mouth was telling me I wasn't his son anymore. My mom kept glancing at him like she wanted to jump in and smooth things over, but she stayed quiet, just tracing her thumb along the edge of the envelope in these tiny repetitive motions. Every time his explanation got close to something real, he'd veer off into vague phrases again, and my brain just started filling in the blanks on its own. Debt, collections, something with the house, something with my name on it again. At one point, my mom finally cut him off in that soft but firm voice she used to use when he'd go too far at the dinner table. She said they didn't have time to dance around it, and that they just needed to be honest. Hearing her say honest actually made me want to laugh, but I swallowed it. She picked up the envelope, smoothed it out on her knees like it was a wrinkled shirt, and leaned forward a little. Her hands were shaking just enough that I could see it from where I was. She said they'd run into some trouble with the house and some paperwork, and that things had gotten messy after my grandma passed away last year. That hit me like a separate punch because no one had even told me my grandma died. I just stared at her while she kept talking about probate and the estate and how they were trying to figure it all out. And the words started to blur around the edges because my brain was stuck on one thing. My grandma was dead, and I'd found out sitting on my own couch months later. She must have seen something change in my face because she paused and said she was sorry they hadn't reached out. She tried to blame it on everything being so chaotic, but that felt like someone blaming a tornado they started themselves. My grandma was the only person in that family who ever made me feel like I wasn't a screw-up for wanting a different life than my dad's. She used to slip me $20 bills when I came over to fix her computer and tell me to keep some for yourself, when my mom would yell from the kitchen to give it back. The idea that she'd been sick, or in a hospital, or lying in a casket somewhere, and nobody thought to text me, made my chest feel tight in a different way. I could feel heat climbing up my neck. My dad shifted in his chair like he knew the silence after that sentence was my anger filling the room. When I finally managed to ask when it happened, my mom told me it had been around Easter, like it was some casual landmark, like, oh yeah, that was the same week the weather started getting better. It was November now. They'd gone through a whole spring and summer without me, buried the only person who ever really backed me up, probably had a funeral, maybe a reception in the church basement with cookies and bad coffee, and I'd been at my desk at work rebooting printers and writing tickets. I thought about the last time I saw my grandma, sitting at her kitchen table with a mug of tea, telling me she'd taken care of a few things and that I shouldn't worry about how your father handles money because I know what I'm doing. At the time, I'd brushed it off as her way of saying she'd leave me her old car or some jewelry or something small. Apparently, whatever she'd done was a lot bigger than any of us realized, because my parents suddenly looked like people who were sitting on a bomb they didn't know how to defuse. My dad finally leaned forward and held out his hand for the envelope like my mom was moving too slow. She passed it over without looking at him, and he pulled out this stack of papers held together with a giant binder clip. The sound of it scraping against the manila made my teeth grind. He flipped through the pages with the kind of clumsy urgency of someone who doesn't really understand what he's looking at, but knows it's important. From where I sat, I could see the first page, my grandma's name in big bold letters, last will and testament, the date, and then lines of text my eyes immediately started hunting through for my own name, like I couldn't help it. My dad cleared his throat again and said something about your name being on some things, and how we were as surprised as anyone. He said it in this defensive way, like he thought I was going to accuse him of forging something right then and there. He finally passed the stack over to me, and the weight of it in my hands felt weirdly symbolic. The paper smelled like old paper always does, ink and dust, and a little bit like the inside of my grandma's hallway closet where she kept her coats. I started scanning, because there was no way I was going to sit there and politely wait for them to summarize. My own name popped out a few paragraphs down, and my vision tunneled around it. The will basically said that after a few small specific gifts, everything else, her house, her savings, some CDs I didn't even know she had, was to be split in a very particular way. There was a section leaving a specific amount to my brother, something smaller to my parents for their support over the years, and then there it was, my name, attached to a much bigger percentage than anyone else. It wasn't like some movie-level fortune, but it was enough to be life-changing for someone like me. It was also very clear. No ambiguity. No as they see fit. My grandma had signed it in her shaky handwriting a year before she died. As I kept reading, the pieces started clicking together in this slow, nauseating way. There were notes from the lawyer, letters about attempts to contact the beneficiary, and a printed email chain where my parents had apparently been responding on my behalf without telling me. My mom's email address was right there, replying to the lawyer's office from an account with my name slapped onto it, saying things like, "I am too busy to come in person. Please coordinate through my parents." I felt my fingers tighten on the edges of the page until they crumpled a little. My dad started talking again, trying to explain that things got confusing when the lawyer couldn't reach me directly and that they'd stepped in so nothing got held up. The more he talked, the more obvious it became that what they'd actually done was try to reroute as much control as possible through themselves. There were also newer letters, stamped with red dates from the last few months, about discrepancies and questions regarding the disposition of assets. One of them mentioned that the court had concerns about the handling of Tyler's portion, since I'd never personally signed anything or appeared. That's when I realized why they were here, in my living room, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen them. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't a sudden urge to reconnect. It was because they'd hit a wall. The system finally demanded that the actual person whose name was on the documents show up, and now, after telling everyone I was dead to them, they needed their dead son to come back to life long enough to fix the mess they made. My mom reached for my wrist as I kept reading, and the touch made me flinch, not dramatically, but enough that she pulled her hand back like she'd been burned. She started talking fast, saying they didn't understand all the legal stuff, that they'd only been trying to keep things simple, that they were always planning to tell me once it was all sorted out. She said the money wasn't really about you versus us. It's about the family, which was basically a greatest hits remix of every argument we'd ever had. My dad, meanwhile, didn't apologize or anything. He went straight to practical mode, saying the lawyer was expecting us on Monday, and that if I could just come down and sign a few things, they could get this all squared away, and everyone would get what they were supposed to get. The way he said everyone made my skin crawl. As they talked over each other, the room seemed to shrink. The stack of papers in my lap suddenly felt like it weighed 50 pounds. My knees were bouncing now, mirroring my mom's earlier. I thought about the version of this story where I'd never found out, where they'd somehow managed to sign enough things in my name to move everything into their control, and I'd keep living my life thinking my grandma had left me nothing. I thought about how they'd already done something similar once with my college fund, how easily they'd justified it to themselves. It wasn't a stretch to imagine them doing it again, just with bigger numbers and more legalese. The difference now was that the process had forced my name into the light, and they needed my body attached to it to make the machine move again. When I finally looked up from the papers, both of them were staring at me with different versions of the same expression. My mom's eyes were pleading, red around the edges. My dad's were hard, calculating, like he was trying to guess which combination of guilt and logic would work on me. It hit me that they hadn't said my grandma's name with any real emotion since walking in. No stories, no she wanted this for you. Nothing about missing her. It was all logistics, all inconvenience. The only time my mom's voice had truly cracked was when she said they didn't know who else to call, and even that felt more like desperation than regret. I could feel something settling in my chest, heavy but solid, like a piece of concrete snapping in a place where something soft used to be. I asked them, as calmly as I could, why they hadn't told me she died. My mom started to say it had been a difficult time, and my dad added something about me, making it clear I didn't want to be part of the family anymore, which was wild considering they were the ones who kicked me out of it. He said they didn't think I'd want to come, and that it would have just caused drama. The way he said drama made it sound like my grief would have been some kind of performance. My mom wiped at her eyes and said they'd regretted not reaching out, but by the time they thought about it, it felt too late. And then, things with the will got complicated. That order of operations said more than anything else. They regretted not calling me when it made their paperwork harder, not when my grandma was in the ground and her chair at the kitchen table was suddenly empty. At some point, my dad leaned back and shifted tactics. He started talking about how this money could help everyone and how they were barely holding onto the house with property taxes and repairs. He mentioned my brother's kids needing a stable place to visit. Like the house was this sacred family landmark and not the same place where he'd told me to get out and never come back. He kept repeating that all I had to do was show up and sign, and not make this harder than it already is. It was the same old script, me as the unreasonable one if I didn't fall in line. My mom chimed in about how this is what your grandmother would have wanted, which stung because she was the only person in that entire mess whose opinion I actually respected. They were using her like a shield, waving her name around to cover their choices. The more they talked, the clearer everything became. The will was straightforward. The lawyer's letters were clear. The only chaos in the situation was them trying to twist something simple into a version where they had the most control and I had the least. They tried to cut me out of my own inheritance while still needing me to make it official. And now, after years of silence and that last night where they declared me dead to them over a loan, they were sitting on my second-hand couch asking me to resurrect myself just long enough to sign my name where they pointed. The bitter part of me wondered if they'd planned to shove me back in the ground again once the ink dried. I don't know what switch flipped inside me, but something did. Maybe it was seeing my grandma's signature next to mine. So clear and intentional, like she'd known exactly what she was doing. Maybe it was the way my dad kept leaning forward like he still had authority over me, like I was 21 again and asking to borrow the car. Or maybe it was the sudden realization that this was the first time in years where I had leverage, where they needed something from me instead of the other way around. Whatever it was, I felt myself settle into this strange calm. Not the kind where you're relaxed, but the kind where your body gets very still because the decision has already been made somewhere deep inside you. I put the papers down on the coffee table and watched their eyes follow the movement like they were waiting for a verdict. I asked them something simple. What exactly did they want me to sign on Monday? My dad immediately started listing things, stumbling over legal terms he clearly didn't understand, and my mom chimed in with phrases like, just standard forms, and nothing that affects your part. Which was hilarious because the whole point of everything they'd done was to affect my part. I interrupted them and said I wanted the lawyer's name. They hesitated. My dad said they'd handle communication and I didn't need to complicate things. That told me everything. I repeated myself, slower. My mom pulled the tote bag onto her lap and started rummaging through it like she'd suddenly lost the ability to find anything. The whole scene felt surreal. These two people who once had complete control of my life suddenly fumbling because I asked a basic question. She finally produced a business card, bent at the corner and smudged with something that looked like foundation. I took it without thanking her. The lawyer's name was printed in gold letters over a dark background. One of those designs meant to look fancy enough to justify charging too much. I didn't know him, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I now had a direct line, something they clearly didn't want. My dad reminded me, in this fatherly tone that made my skin crawl, that we're all better off if we go in unified. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I didn't feel like arguing the obvious. There was no we here. There hadn't been for a very long time. The tension in the room shifted when I reached for my phone. My dad straightened in the chair. My mom sat frozen with her hands clasped around the strap of her tote bag. I typed the lawyer's number into my contacts, not bothering to hide the screen. Then I opened the call app. I didn't call, just hovered my thumb over the green button. My dad asked what I was doing, and I told him calmly that I wanted to schedule my own appointment for Monday. For a second, the only sound was the hum of the heater. Then my dad said something he probably didn't mean to let slip. You don't need to get involved in all that. That sentence hit me harder than anything else in that entire stack of papers. My grandma had left something to me, with intention and clarity, and he was still talking like I was a child who had wandered somewhere I didn't belong. That was the moment I realized something important. They still didn't see me as an adult. Not really. They just saw me as an inconvenience or a tool, depending on the day. And for the first time in years, I wasn't emotionally scrambling to make sense of that. I just saw it clearly, cleanly, like someone had wiped fog off a window. I lowered the phone and told them I'd go to the appointment on my own. My mom immediately said that wasn't what your grandmother wanted, which made something in me snap. I asked her if Grandma wanted them pretending to be me over email, if she wanted me finding out about her death from a stack of paperwork, if she wanted them using her name to guilt me into signing something I hadn't even read yet. My mom's face crumpled like tissue. My dad's jaw tightened. He started to say I was being unreasonable, but I talked over him, something I never did growing up. I told them I'd handle my part of the inheritance myself, and that if the lawyer had questions, he'd hear directly from me. And then I said something I didn't plan, something that came out smoother than it should have. You two told me I was dead to you. I'm just acting like you meant it. My dad froze. My mom's hand flew to her mouth. The silence that filled the room after that felt like when you step outside right after a heavy snow. Thick, cold, strangely peaceful. They didn't leave right away. My mom tried to soften things, saying they'd made mistakes and just wanted to fix everything. My dad kept staring at me like he was trying to calculate the odds of me changing my mind. Neither of them apologized. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. The closest my mom got was saying she wished things had gone differently, but the past is the past, which sounded suspiciously like a request to pretend none of it happened. My dad asked me one last time if I'd at least consider letting them come with me on Monday. I told him no, without raising my voice. He didn't argue. He just stood up slowly, like the weight of the last hour had finally settled on him. While they gathered their things, I noticed something I hadn't before. The tote bag my mom had brought was half unzipped, and inside I could see envelopes, loose papers, and what looked like a checkbook. They hadn't come to talk. They'd come prepared to manage, to oversee, maybe even to pressure me into signing everything right then if things had gone their way. That realization made the next part easier. When they walked to the door, I didn't follow. I just stayed in the living room and waited for the sound of the door closing. My mom hesitated in the doorway for a few seconds, but she didn't turn back. My dad murmured something I couldn't hear, maybe goodbye, maybe nothing, and then they were gone. The apartment felt different once they left. Bigger somehow, like their absence made more space than their presence ever had. I sat there staring at the spot where the papers had been on the coffee table, and I felt this weird combination of exhaustion and clarity. The air smelled a little like their cologne still, but underneath that was the usual scent of my place. Detergent, coffee, cold air from the balcony door I'd forgotten to close. I let the lawyer's business card sit on my knee for a long minute before finally picking up my phone. My thumb hovered over the call button again, and for a second I hesitated, not because I doubted my decision, but because making that call felt like crossing a line I couldn't step back from. When the receptionist answered, I introduced myself by my full name. The moment I said it, something inside me straightened. She put me on hold for a moment, then transferred me to the lawyer directly, which surprised me. He sounded older, brisk, and a little annoyed, probably because he'd been chasing my email for months. I told him I'd just received the documents and wanted to schedule an appointment for Monday morning. The man exhaled in relief so loudly I actually heard it through the phone. He said he was very glad to finally speak to me and that there were some important discrepancies he needed to clear up. When I asked if my parents needed to be there, he said, very quickly, no, absolutely not. That confirmed more than anything my parents had said. After the call, I sat there for a while, letting my brain catch up. My hands finally stopped shaking. I went into the kitchen, poured the cold coffee down the drain, and made a fresh cup without thinking too hard about it. The simple action steadied me. I kept seeing flashes of my grandma's handwriting, the way she'd loop her GS and the way her signature always dipped at the end. I wondered what she'd thought when she wrote that will. If she knew leaving me that much would cause a storm. If she trusted that I'd figure it out even if the rest of the family didn't treat me like part of it anymore. Maybe she'd known exactly how things would unfold. Maybe that was the point. That night, I didn't go out, didn't turn on the TV, didn't call Emma. I just sat with the papers spread out across my coffee table, reading every line, every attachment, every note from the attorney's office. The more I read, the more obvious it became that my parents hadn't just been trying to make things easier. They'd been maneuvering. There were forms they'd filled out that specifically asked for my signature, and someone had signed them in a handwriting that didn't look even remotely like mine. There were emails where the lawyer asked to speak to me directly, and my mom had replied that I was recovering from an accident or traveling for work, depending on the week. It wasn't just messy. It wasn't confusion. It was deliberate. By the time it got fully dark outside, I had gone from hurt to angry to something sharper and cleaner. Not revenge exactly. Not spite. Just a sense of finally understanding the whole map of the situation instead of the scraps they'd fed me over the years. I realized that Monday wasn't just a meeting. It was the first time in my entire life I'd be walking into something with my family's name on it as the actual owner of my share, not the kid they could shove into the background. My parents had built their whole strategy on the assumption that I'd either cave or disappear. And now, for the first time, neither option was on the table. When I finally crawled into bed, my apartment felt quiet in a way that wasn't lonely. I thought about the version of me from 5 years ago, standing in my parents' living room with trash bags full of clothes, hearing them say I was dead to them. I thought about how small and confused I'd felt then. And then I thought about how I felt now. Tired, sure, but grounded. A little stronger. Not dead. Very much alive, and very much ready to handle what came next. I fell asleep with the light still on and the papers still spread out on the table, like evidence waiting for someone to finally look at it straight on. The next morning, Monday, I woke up earlier than my alarm, which almost never happens. There was this weird clarity in my head, like the fog that usually hangs over a Monday had burned off before the sun even came up. My apartment was cold because I'd forgotten to turn the heat up before bed, but it actually helped keep me alert. When I walked into the living room, the stack of papers from the night before was still spread across the coffee table, and seeing them in daylight made everything feel even more real. The signatures, the emails, the dates, nothing looked blurry or surreal anymore. It all lined up into a picture that made sense in the worst and most liberating way. My parents had tried to quietly fold me out of the process, and the system wouldn't let them. Simple as that. I showered, made the same cheap coffee I always do, and sat at the table to look over the will one more time. My apartment was completely silent except for the hum of the fridge. The quiet let me notice small details I'd missed yesterday, like the fact that the lawyer had actually mailed me copies months ago, but they'd never reached me. Probably because they'd been intercepted, or maybe because my address had been updated somewhere along the process. I didn't know which possibility made me angrier. By the time it was close to 9, I put everything in a clean folder, shoved it into my backpack, and headed out. The cold air outside slapped me awake in a good way. I drove downtown with the kind of calm you get right before doing something that changes things. The lawyer's office was in one of those old brick buildings downtown that had been renovated into something sleek on the inside, while still pretending to be historical on the outside. The hallway smelled like carpet cleaner and stale office air. When I walked into the actual office, the receptionist recognized my name immediately. Her eyebrows shot up a little, just enough for me to know that my situation wasn't normal. She offered me coffee, but my stomach was already tight, so I just sat in the stiff chair and waited while the elevator music hummed through the speakers. When the lawyer finally opened his office door, he looked at me like someone who'd been waiting a long time for this exact moment. He was older, late 60s maybe, with gray hair and a slight hunch, like he'd been living in those office chairs for decades. He shook my hand firmly and gestured for me to sit. His desk was covered in neat stacks of papers and a single mug that said, "World's okayest dad," which would have made me laugh on another day. He didn't waste time. He told me he'd been trying to reach me for months and had been increasingly concerned about the responses he'd been getting. He even pulled up the email threads and pointed at the ones sent from the fake account. Hearing him say, "These were clearly not written by you," made my chest tighten in a different way, some mix of anger and validation I wasn't prepared for. He went through everything slowly. My grandma's intentions, the percentages, the legal requirements for beneficiaries to be contacted directly, the suspicious inconsistencies that had flagged the case for review. He asked me if I'd authorized my parents to act on my behalf. I said no. He asked if I'd ever told anyone I'd been in an accident or unable to attend meetings. I said no again. He nodded like he'd already known, but hearing me confirm it mattered. Then he told me plainly that my parents' actions could have been considered fraudulent if things had continued the way they were going. Not dramatic, not criminal court dramatic, but enough to legally disqualify them from managing anything tied to my portion. When he said that, I felt something click, a shift so subtle I almost didn't notice it. My parents had walked into my apartment acting like they were still the ones in charge, like this whole mess was above my head, and I should be grateful they were handling it. But here, in this office, the reality was flipped. I wasn't a problem to be managed. I wasn't an accessory. I was the beneficiary, the key signature, the actual voice the court had been waiting for. And for the first time since I was a teenager, I felt like the power wasn't in their hands anymore. It was in mine. He asked if I wanted to move forward independently from my parents, and the answer came out of me before I even thought about it. Yes. Completely. He nodded, pulled out a few documents, and walked me through each one. They weren't anything sneaky, just confirmations, proof of identity forms, and a declaration that I hadn't authorized anyone else to speak for me. When I signed them, I felt something shift internally, like a door closing behind me. Not in a sad way, in a solid way. The kind of finality you get when you stop trying to fix something that doesn't want to be fixed. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair and told me the next steps. He said the court would likely reach out directly within a week, that they'd probably request a brief statement about the unauthorized communications, and that my portion of the estate would then be processed cleanly. He said it plainly. You don't owe your parents' involvement in this process. Hearing that from someone who didn't know my history hit harder than I expected. It felt like someone cracking open a window in a stuffy room. Walking out of that office felt like stepping into a different version of my life. The cold air downtown didn't bite the same way. I sat in my car for a minute with the heater running and just let myself breathe. My phone buzzed twice, messages from my mom. I didn't open them right away. I wasn't afraid of what they said anymore. I just didn't feel like letting their words be the first thing that touched this new calm. I waited until I got home, then read them in the quiet. The first message was long, full of guilt, and we were just trying to help, and you've misunderstood everything. The second was shorter, sent after she realized I wasn't responding. It said they were disappointed, and that I was choosing to make this harder than it needed to be. I didn't reply. I didn't even feel compelled to reply. Not out of anger, out of clarity. I finally understood that no matter how carefully I explained myself, they'd always twist it into something that made sense to them. And for the first time, that didn't gut me. It didn't feel like rejection. It felt like truth. The kind of truth that frees you instead of trapping you. That evening, when Emma came over, she asked if everything was okay. Usually I'd say, yeah, it's fine, out of habit, but instead I told her what happened. Maybe not every detail, but enough. She listened, really listened, and the way her face softened made something in my chest loosen. She didn't try to fix it, didn't give some big speech. She just sat next to me on the couch, leaned her shoulder against mine, and said, I'm glad you handled it your way. And for some reason, that was exactly what I needed to hear. Later that night, when I finally sat alone in the quiet again, I realized something. My parents hadn't won. Not this time. I wasn't the scared kid with trash bags full of clothes anymore. I wasn't the invisible name on a document they could manipulate. I'd walked into that office, signed my own name, told my own story, and reclaimed something they'd tried to bury. And even though there were still things to sort through, money, paperwork, probably more angry texts, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt manageable. Mine to carry, not theirs to control. I turned off the lights, stood in the middle of my living room, and let the weight of the day settle. My life wasn't suddenly perfect. My family wasn't magically repaired. But I'd walked away with something more valuable than any amount of inheritance, control of my own story. For the first time in years, I felt the kind of quiet that didn't scare me. The kind that meant something was actually over. And something better was starting to take shape.